Welcome to this presentation from Autodesk. In this presentation, we'll be looking at some of the new features that are in Form Z7. Now, as you recall from part 1 of this series, we looked at the interface and the modeling tools required to conceptualize this interior design space. Now, in part 2, we'll continue to explore our conceptual design by highlighting numerous visualization, rendering, fabrication, and presentation features in Form Z7. Now, what's some of the stuff that we'll be looking at today? We'll be looking at the way that materials are now easier to use in Form Z7 with new drag and drop type technology, live interactive texture mapping right there on the object. We'll also look at the way Form Z automatically texture maps your objects for you. And there's also a new, easier way to be able to create texture groups that apply different mapping parameters on different parts of the same object. We'll also look at the new Billboard Tool, which is a real quick, easy way to take any image and have it automatically mapped onto a flat polygon. It builds the polygon and automatically maps it on there for you. It's great for entourage items or maybe an underlay sketch. You can bring that in and actually scale it to the proper size, or you can use the Billboard Tool just to quickly bring in an image map and put it on a flat plane to further construct that geometry then using some of the other tools. We'll also look at the new drag and drop dynamic lighting, which makes it easier to light the scene by being able to quickly place those lights in the scene and dynamically change any of the parameters right there in the modeling window. And we'll take a look at that today also. Now, something else that's new in Form Z7 is the new Sun Position Pellet. Now, we've always had a database in Form Z for as long as I can remember. So you can always go in there, type a city at any given date, time, any time of the year, and it automatically positions that sunlight for you. Now, that's been in there. What's new is a new dynamic interactive pellet, which has all those parameters all in a one-stop shop here. So you can just drag the slider to change the time of day, the day of the year, and choose the city right there. And it's live, it's interactive, and we'll see how that works right in just a few moments. We'll also take a brief look at components. This will be replacing the symbols in Form Z, and so any symbols you have from previous versions will then be automatically converted into components, and we'll look at the advantages and the ease of use of the new type of component structure for commonly used items in your scene. We'll also take a brief look at global illumination. Now, the ambient occlusion option, that's not new in 7. We've had that for a long time. But to sort of finish the scene out here in part 2, we will have to render it for our final visualization rendering. And so I did have to turn the ambient occlusion on. I always use that because it just gives you more of a realistic render. It just subtracts light wherever two surfaces meet. I'll show you where that option is. We'll also briefly look at the final gather setting, and really these are just on-off switches. When you turn them on, when you render your scene, it'll just add that special effect to you for your rendering. And of course, all the final gather does is bounce light in the scene. So of course, the image on the left looks pretty good, but by turning final gather on, you get more of a realistic rendering by having that light bounce around a little bit in that scene. Let's see what we can do with part 2 here to visualize, render, fabricate, and present our model using Form Z7. So let's switch over to Form Z. Here we go. And there it is. Now, as you recall from the part 1, we went ahead and built all the geometry for our interior space. And here's our floor slab here. And so let's look at how we can render the different parts of the objects that we created in the previous session. Now, what we'll do is we'll go over to our workspace here. Since we're done with the modeling aspect, we'll switch over to the rendering and animation workspace. Now, we're not going to animate anything today. Be sure to come back and look at some of the other presentations where we'll cover some of these other features. So let's turn off the animation palette for now. We're basically going to be looking at just a few tools here today. We'll pull these off of the attributes suite of icons here so we can paint and control the map and map textures on the object. So let's see how this works. How do you create a material in Form Z7? Well, look at the materials palette over here. I double click any of the materials, and you see it brings up the material parameters palette here, so I can change the color and reflection, transparency, load an image map if I want. And notice down here at the bottom, all of our predefined materials are all loaded right there in that same palette. And you can see these are organized in different categories. So I can choose a carpeting or landscaping materials, wood, whatever I want. Some of these come from the old Form Z. We've updated those and modified them. Some come from Bonsai, and there's also new additional materials. So there's literally hundreds of materials here that we we can get started with. If you see one that you like, just simply take it and drag and drop it onto your material, so that all those predefined parameters are now assigned to your material up here. So this is a lot easier than what it was in the previous version, in which you had to go into a couple dialogues, you had to find the material, apply it, and come back to the material server style. So here it's one stop, boom, it's right there in one single palette. All right, so once we have our material created, how do we apply it to the object? We'll just simply take that material and drag and drop it right on the object. There, now it's applied to that object. Okay, now how do we apply different materials to different faces of that same object? Well, I just happen to have some other materials already created. And actually, all of these different styles of carpeting were all pulled out from the predefined material library that comes with FormZ. And if I want to apply it to a single face, I hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows. And you can see now I can drag and drop it onto a single face of that object. So that's how easy it is to just paint these different faces here. Let's put maybe a brown carpeting there, maybe over here, maybe some green in the corner here, so on and so forth. And see how easy it is to quickly paint different faces of the object by holding down the Command key. All right. Let's continue on with our walls that we created in part 1. And you can see with those, this is one single object. This could be separate objects, but in this case, because of the tools that we used, this is one single object, and we're going to apply some mapping to that. So let's put a wallpaper type material. This is another predefined material. It comes with FormZ, so I created that material. Now I drag and drop it on there. We're all set. Let's zoom into the walls over here. And let's say I want to modify the size or scale of that material on the object. And that's where we use our Edit Texture tool, which is located right here. So with that, I click on any face of the object, and we get our controls for the size and scale of that texture right there in the modeling window. I don't have to go into any external dialog box or anything to change that. So you can see I can modify the overall scale. I can modify the horizontal width, vertical height. I can rotate it, move it, anything that I want. Now, one thing you should observe is that as I move and scale that texture on the object, you see it's the same mapping system for all the faces on that object. And FormZ automatically texture maps your objects, and so you can see it applied one single texture group for all the faces of that object. Okay. Now let's say I want to assign a different material to a different face. We've already seen that. Just hold down the Command key, drag and drop this other material onto the face, and that's applied to just that face of the object. Now notice if I were to rescale that, notice that as I'm changing the scale, it's still changing with all the other faces of the object. And you're saying, well, what if I want to scale that differently than the rest of the object? That's where the Map Texture tool comes in over here. So I'll click on that. Now if I click on the whole object, then you can see it'll actually remap the entire object for me. But if I hold down the Command key on Mac or the Control key on Windows, I can apply the Map Texture tool just to this one face. So I click on the one face, and now I've created a separate texture group for that one face. So now you can see if I use the Edit Texture tool and I modify the scale of the texture on that one face, you can see that is a independent texture group from the rest of the object. So I can scale that independently from the rest of the objects. All right, so that's how easy it is to apply different mapping and colors to, or different materials, different faces of the object. And you're saying, well, that's sort of nice, but what if I have lots of faces? I have a very complicated object, and there's lots of faces that I need to put into different texture groups. Well, it's just as easy to do that. What I can do is maybe use the Pick Part tool, which is right here. All right, and that allows me to pre-specify the topological level that I want to pick the parts from. So let's set that to face. Window, pick all the faces. And then I'll use this material that I want to apply to that. So I can use the Paint tool, just click a blank area, and the material I have selected is then applied to all those faces. Now I can also use the Map Texture tool now. I click a blank area, and it's going to remap and create a separate texture group just for those selected faces. Now you notice that in the options here, it's going to do the best match, meaning FormZ is going to figure out the best mapping system for all the faces on the object, and it will apply different mapping to different parts based on the shape and the curvature and things like that. So it has this very intelligent algorithm that figures out the best mapping for the object. So it does all that for you. If you want to override that, you can do that. So for example, here we can override and say, well, I really want it to be flat, so I can change that if I want. Now you'll notice that now that I created a separate texture group, you can see now if I use the Edit Texture tool on any face of that object, you can see it treats it as a single texture group. So now I can move that material, rotate it, and do anything that I want, and it behaves independent from the rest of the object. All right, and that's how easy the new texture grouping is inside of FormZ 7. All right, let's move on to the beams that we created from part 1. We can see that we want to maybe apply a nice wood texture to these. Actually, If you watch part 1, you can see how we actually created these. And we have a red oak wood material. That's, again, this is from our predefined materials. If you don't find one that you like, well, you can just create your own, load in the image map, or use some of the procedurals. There's computer-generated procedurals there to create your own wood grain patterns and things like that. But we'll just simply drag and drop this onto the object. All right, we zoom in. We notice that the wood grain's going the wrong direction. So we'll use our Edit Texture tool to further modify that. So let's rotate. So maybe we'll take the wood grain so it goes horizontal. Maybe we can move that image anywhere that we want. So we can move that material, maybe stretch it out a little bit, and just get it exactly the way we want. Now, once we're done with that, you say, well, now I have to apply that to all the other beams also. I'm not going to do those one by one. I want to speed that up. So what I'll do is I'll select all of these other objects, and I can use the Copy Attribute tool, which is right here. And now I can pick the object that I want to copy the attributes from. So I click on that beam that I've already textured, and notice that all the attributes of that object are assigned to all the other beams. So we're done. So we just have to do one, and we can then copy that to all the other ones. And now notice that there are some other options here too, so you can see that it can copy more than just the material and texture mapping attributes. We can turn each of these options on and off as we use that tool. Okay. All right, with that, what I'd like to do is maybe move on and look at some other new features in Forms E7, which is the Billboard Tool. If we go back to that rendered image, we have the plant back here. Let's see how that was created. We have some artwork on the wall. Here's a tool that helped me with that. And it's called the Billboard Tool. And that is actually more of a modeling type tool. So let's go back to our modeling workspace here. And that tool is located right here in the Generate suite of icons. So click on the Billboard Tool. And you can see all the options are over here. And if I turn the grid and the axis on, we can sort of see where we're at in 3D space here. And you can see that all it's doing is taking that image map and mapping it onto a polygon for me. So I can load any type of image that I want. So maybe what we'll do is load the image of a plant. So let's see if we can find an image here, maybe right there. Load it. And there it is. It's ready to be placed in our scene. We can control the position of where we place it. We can place it perpendicular to the plane. We can place it so it aligns with the view. So for example, if I were to place that billboard item right there, now you can see if I spin my view, the align with view attribute is automatically assigned to that flat polygon there. Okay. Now, of course, you can see if I look in the materials parameters here, you can see that it automatically created that material for me. So if I were to double click on that, you can say I can change any of these parameters, maybe add a transparency. So I'll load that exact same image again as a transparency map. So now I can use the alpha channel information if it's there to be able to clip out the background so that the background's transparent. So there we go. And of course, we can still see the edges of the polygon, but if we're in a rendered mode, then of course, obviously, those edges of the objects won't be there. Okay, so that's how we able to quickly add those plants in there. Now, of course, we do have components. We have plants and trees and people and all sorts of things you can place in your scene, but this is if we don't have one that you want, so you can load any image and quickly bring it in as a billboard item. Okay. Now, another great use for this new billboard tool is to bring in a underlay sketch. So let's select the billboard tool. Let's load our underlay sketch. And this can be any type of scanned image, any kind of pixel image. There it is right there. Let's load that, open it, pick, TIFF, target, whatever you got. And we bring that in. So we're ready to place that in our scene. Let's click it on the plane. And we can also change the size. So we can give it a, maybe let's say a height of 10 feet. And notice that it automatically adjusts the width so that it maintains that proper ratio of the pixel size of that image. So let's place that right there maybe. Okay. Now, once that's placed, you can see that maybe if it's not at the right scale, we could easily scale it using the measure tool by selecting the object. We can measure any part of that object. So maybe measure it from maybe this point here to right there. And you say, well, it's 3'4". That's not what I want. So I go up here in the tool options here. I can type in 30 feet. And I click update. And of course, you can see it automatically scales that billboard object to be at the proper scale. So that's a quick way to bring in some underlay sketches. Now it's ready to be traced over. And here's a third way that this tool can be used. We can place that artwork on the wall. So we'll go ahead and turn on some of our other layers here. There's a floor, ceiling, beams. I have a view that's already set up inside of here. So let's make that view active. And we want to place some artwork on the wall right there. So let's select our billboard tool. And let's load the image that we want to place on the wall there. So here it is right there. All right. And it's ready to be placed. All right, sort of big right now, and we need to maybe rotate it, so all sorts of parameters to control the orientation as we're placing it on the object. Now notice it is placing it flush with the face of that wall, and we need to sort of offset that a little bit, so there's an offset option here. So we can just maybe say offset 1 inch, there we go, and place it on the wall. Now of course it's sort of big, so we can give it a scale. Maybe instead of 8'4", we'll set the height to be 5 feet, and there we go. Now you can see that we can actually automatically rescale that ratio to whatever height we want. So place it on the wall, and there we go. There's our artwork. And of course, we can continue on. Once it's placed on there, it's just an image map on a flat polygon. And if we want, we can maybe use a thicken tool to give that some thickness, and then use the slice tool to maybe draw some spline curves and some lines to sort of splice and cut that up into the different pieces like what we see here. Let's go back to our bird's eye view here, maybe something like that. And now that we got sort of a basic understanding of how the materials work and how we can texture map them, control the size on our objects, let's talk about another integral part of the rendering and visualization process, and that's lighting. So there's all sorts of new features and techniques that we have in Formsy 7 to sort of speed up and make it easier to light your scene. Turn on and off a couple layers here, because what I want to do is turn on just the floor and just the walls here. And what I'm going to do is look at the new light tools. So if we go to our rendering workspace here, you can see there's a new set of tools which allows us to drag and drop lights into our scene. Let's turn the grid and axis off for just a second here, and let's place a distant light into our scene. And notice that it's just like any other object that you build inside of Formsy 7. Now it's in this result buffer mode, so we can move that dynamically anywhere that we want in the scene. Now as we move that, you're saying, well, wait a second, I don't see any difference in the lighting of the scene or the shadows or anything like that. Well, that's because we're in shaded work mode. So look up here in the display options. You can see that we're in the shaded work mode, which means we have a fully lit scene. So it does not use the lights that's in the lights palette. What it does is it has its own internal way that it globally lights every part of your model. So whether you're in the bottom, inside a building, wherever you're at, it's fully lit. And this is great when you're just originally conceptualizing and building the different parts of your model. But if you want to see the actual effect of the lighting in the scene, then of course we need to switch to this next mode, which is shaded full. So I click on that, and now you can see if I were to move that light source, you can see now it is actually live interactively using the actual light sources themselves. So we get the shadow effects. Now something else we can do is actually control the sun position. There's a new sun position palette located right there. And we can bring it up whenever we want. And you can see I can interactively and dynamically modify the time of day. So as I slide that back and forth, you can see that we can control the time of day interactively. We can control the day, just moving that slider back and forth. We can choose any city in any part of the world. So our entire database is set up right there. We can also animate this. So if I click the play button right here, you can see that the animation is already set up for us. All we have to do is click the play button, and it'll go through any time of day or through a series of days throughout the year. And we don't actually have any external sunlight coming in. This is an interior space here, so let's take that light and we're going to delete it, and we're going to use the actual light sources inside of our space here. So I just happen to have a layer here that has some of the light fixtures already created. So let's go back to shaded work for just a moment here. And you can see these are some pretty simple shapes. You can see I just drew a profile and revolved it for the light fixtures back here. Here we have a cylinder, top and bottom face missing, and we swept a circle along there. So it gives us the basic conceptualization of the different light fixtures that are going to be in the space. And then of course our goal is to have it look like this right here. Well, first thing we need to do is place some lights in here. So let's go to our shaded full mode. Let's go to our lights palette here and say, well, let's add a point light. So I click the point light option, I drag it across the scene, and notice I get live interactive feedback of where that light's going to be placed. So if I place it right there, you can see I can modify any of the parameters inside the tool options here. And of course, just like any other object, I'm in this result buffer mode. So I can very easily dynamically modify the parameters of that light as soon as it's placed in the scene. Let's place maybe some cone lights back here. Let's put a cone light in this fixture. All right. And once again, we have all these parameters we can modify here. Change the center of interest, change the inner and outer angle here of our cone, so on and so forth. Okay. So let's place a few more in here. So let's place a light in that fixture and maybe one in this fixture over here. And now I think you get the idea of how quickly we can add lights in the scene. Now, here's another new thing in Formsy 7 is we can actually edit the parameters of multiple objects at the same time. So I can actually select all these cone lights here. And if I look in the tool options palette, I can see the parameters for whatever I have selected. And so, of course, these are all the same. So it'll give me the parameters for those. So I can move that outer angle back and forth. And you can see I can, in real time, dynamically modify any of the light parameters for multiple objects at the same time. Now, of course, I still use light groups. Light groups has been in FormZ for a long time. It's still in 7, so you can put your lights in different groups, override the attributes for the lights in that group. But this is just sort of a quick way where you don't even have to put them in light groups to quickly change parameters of multiple lights at the same time. We need to finish out the scene by placing the other point lights in here, but one other little trick that I do, of course you talk to a lot of people that have different ways that they create interior scenes and light it. One technique that I like to use, and that's adding area lights into the scene to sort of flood some extra light into the space. So what I'll do is I'll select the vector line tool and create an object. It can be any object, and here just a single flat plane will work fine. Okay, double click that and extrude that up to the height that we want, maybe about the same height as the wall, and that's just an object. All right, now let's create that or convert that into an area light. So click on the area light tool, click on the object, and the object becomes a light source. And so now you can see any object can be a light source. So we can go in and maybe move that area light where we want it to be, and you can see just a quick way to sort of flood or add additional light into that space. Go to our lights palette. We can see that they're all added to our lights palette here, and of course we can have additional control and flexibility within the lights palette here. But I'm going to turn the visibility for those lights off. They're still turned on, but I don't want to look at the symbol for those anymore, so I can turn those on and off inside the lights palette. At this point here, since we have all our materials set up, our texture mapping, we have lights in the scene, maybe we want to try some different design variations. And so let's take a brief look at components before we do the final rendering of our scene. So let's go back to a shaded work mode, and I'm going to go back to my home view here. Actually, let's go back inside the space there. And what I'm going to do is turn on the additional layers that have all the rest of the items that we built in part 1. All right, so let's talk briefly about components. So go to the palettes pull-down menu, bring up the components palette, and we can see that I've already created some components out of these items. Any type of repetitive object, I like to create a component, place it multiple times, so if I change one, the rest of them update. FormZ comes with all sorts of components already set up for you. There's people, trees, furniture, the list goes on. You can already place those in the scene if you want. Now, the first question you're going to ask is, well, how do you create a component in FormZ 7? Well, I'll show you. Let's go to our modeling workspace. So that's actually more of a modeling tool than it is a rendering tool. So here the component tools are located right here. So we can place and create components. So let's see how to create one. Just maybe zoom into this table. Let's say we want to create a component out of all these different parts that make up that table. So I select all the parts with the pick tool, hold down the shift key, grab all those parts, and then use the create component tool and click for the origin of where you want to place it from. Type in the name. How about Matt's table? There we go. Click OK. And now that is now a component, and of course it's been added. So let's say we want to place it in the scene. So I go back to view 1. So it animates back to that view, and I'm ready to place it. So I'll click the place component tool, select the component that you want to place, and you can see it'll place it perpendicular to the drawing grid, wherever that is located. Okay, and once it's placed, of course, you can move and copy it also, and each copy that you move and copy will be a component also. Now, the next thing we want to look at is, now that we know how to create them, how do we edit them? And so there's a few different ways to do that based on what you're trying to do. One method is we can just right-click on the object and say, edit this component. So you don't have to go into any external libraries or anything. So let's zoom into these back light fixtures here. If I right-click on any one of those components, I can say, edit component. Click on it. And now you can see it also highlights all the other components in the scene. So I know if I edit this one, it's going to change all the other ones that I see here. All right, so let's just make some changes. As I said, I created this light fixture by just revolving a profile. So if I show the controls of that revolve profile, you can see I can go in and maybe change the shape of that. Maybe look like a different type of fixture here. All right, change color, add geometry, whatever you want to do. You can edit anything in that component right here in the modeling window. When I'm all done, I right-click and say Component Complete, and then it'll update that component and all the other components that are in that scene also. Okay, so that's one way of doing that. Let's go back to our original view over here. Now, a second way is, let's say you don't want to right-click and edit the component, and this is especially useful when you have multiple nested type of components, and we have a neat little feature for that, which is called unlock components. If this is turned on, then it unlocks all the components in your scene. So now you can see it doesn't treat the components as components. It lets you select any part of any object, whether it's in a component or not. So let's make a change here. Now I have full access to every object in the scene. So maybe what I'll do is I'll select maybe the top and the bottom ring here. This is just a circle that's swept along the top edge of that cylindrical object. Now if I look in the tool options and the parameters, you can see I can edit all these simultaneously. So you can see it's giving me the sweeping parameters here. So let's change the radius of that circle from 1/2 inch to 1 inch. So I change that, and notice that I get this little dialog pops up. It says, hey, wait a second, you just changed an object, but this object happens to be inside of a component. So what do you want to do? If I click the update component option, it'll update that component and all the components in your scene. If you click the make new component, what it'll do is actually make this a brand new component and will not update all the other ones in the scene. So in this case, I'm going to click update component, meaning it'll update this one and all the other ones in the scene. And we're done. Okay. Now here's another way that we can use the components in Forms E7. What we can do is maybe turn the unlock component option, turn that option off. I'm going to select all of these light fixtures that we have here. So I got the pick tool active, hold the shift key to pick multiple components. And if you look in the parameters here in the tool options, you'll see that's giving me all the information of what I have selected, including the type of component that I have selected right now. So if I go into my components palette, you can see that I can now choose a different type of component, like maybe this type of light fixture, and I drag and drop this component onto the icon right here, which is what I have selected. And of course it's going to update all of those components to the new one that I dragged and dropped onto that one. There you go. So that's a quick way to make changes there. Another way that this can be used is we can try different levels of complexity for your components. So for example, let's say I have the bench in here and I'm almost ready for the final rendering. So I want to add the more detailed type bench into the scene. So I can select all those benches. These benches don't have rounding and some other features in it. So I'll just select those for now. And what I'll do is go to our components palette. And I'm going to take the more detailed bench, which is this one right here, and drag and drop that onto the icon right there. And it's going to update all of those selected components to the new, more detailed bench that has rounding and things like that on it. Okay. There's much more we can do with the components, but that's all I have time to show today. Let's say our scene's ready and we're ready to render it. Here's all of our display modes up here. As we saw, there's shaded work, shaded full. I can switch back between these modes. If I click on the render zone button, of course, it'll render zone our scene and do a render zone rendering. What if I want to get into the options for that? Well, go to the display pull down, and there's a display options palette that we can have open whenever we want. Actually, the key shortcut is F9. So when that's open, you can see that I can actually select some of these other display modes without actually activating them in the scene. So I can do a hidden line, a sketch render mode, maybe make it look like an oil painting or stipple pattern or something. There's a doodle sketch mode, which makes it look like a hand sketch effect. I click render zone, and notice that I get all the parameters here, and it doesn't render the scene yet. It lets me modify all these parameters until I get it the way I want, and then I click the render button. So I just want to show you here, if I go to the global illumination tab in the render zone display type, you can see this is where the ambient occlusion is, so I can turn that on here. Here's where the final gather option is, and you can turn that on also. So this will subtract light from corners, this will bounce the light in the scene, and of course there are parameters that we can use to control the amount of ambient occlusion that we apply to our scene. So once we have that set up, we click the render button, and we end up with our final rendering that looks like this. This was a single pass rendering. I rendered it, saved it as a JPEG image, and I'm done. So there's no post-processing or layer effects or anything done with this image. I just want to take just a few more minutes and just show a few other additional visualization, rendering, and fabrication features that are in Forms E7. One of the tools that I didn't have time to show today, but I do want to mention it here though, that there is a match view tool. So you can match a 3D model to a background photograph. Just load that image, and you can click points on your model and then click a point in the background pixel image, and it'll match those, and you can automatically prospectively match your model with that background photograph. And you can also ray trace shadows onto that image also. As we saw in part 1, we did look at the clipping planes. These are non-destructive dynamic planes that you can move through your scene. You can have multiple planes turned on at the same time. This is a great visualization tool, but you can also make those permanent. So there's an option to click on one of those planes and say make it permanent, it does a Boolean cut section through your model. So you can use that for construction documents. Okay. Now we do have a dedicated section tool, and what that does is it works sort of like the clipping planes, but it's just a single plane. You move it through, and when you say you're done, it automatically cuts the section at that location, specifically for cutting a Boolean section cut through your model using any plane. Another way to visualize and annotate your model is to use the 3D dimensions. These can be associated to your object if you want them to be. So you can see if you attach it to a point or segment of the object, if you reshape the object or modify it, then that dimension will automatically update with it. As we saw in part 1, there is the contour tool that we used to take a simple NURB surface, we thickened it, and then use the contour tool to cut cross members or our beams for the ceiling. Now there's a couple options in that tool. As you saw, we can leave it at the elevation, but there's also the other option which allowed us to lay them flat on the XY plane. And so now when it automatically lays those out for us, these are true spline cross sections that can be sent to any CNC machine to have them automatically cut out for us. Now, another option for this, since we have them already cut out flat, let's say we're not sending them to a CNC machine, but we do want to create some construction documentation for these cross sections. We do have a new curve to arcs tool, which allows you to take any spline curve and convert it into a series of arcs. And then with those arcs, we can then actually dimension the actual position and radius of where all those arcs are to create a construction document. Right. Now there's also many other tools like the unfold tool, and so you can see I just had some fun here. Just use the roof tool to create a three-dimensional roof. I used the unfold tool to unfold it. I printed it here on a printer at the office here and used some scissors and glue to sort of fold that and do a quick little rapid prototyping project. That's sort of fun. Now as for 3D printing, true rapid prototyping here, since FormZ is a true solids modeler, always has been, is now, and always will be a true solids modeler, which is a perfect companion for the 3D printing process because it can only print solid objects. And so also, in addition to that, we also have more tools that can even help you out even further. There's a print prep tool, which automatically analyzes your model to make sure it prints right the first time. There's an object doctor that can heal any irregularities that may exist if you're bringing in geometry from some other program. There's also a thicken tool because the complex geometry that can be created with a NURBS tool, sometimes the stuff is surface information, and so you can easily thicken or shell any type of surface object into a solid object, which will then be understood by the 3D printing process because it has to be solids to 3D print it. We didn't even touch on any of the animation. We'll have some other presentations that cover some of that. It's just easier to use with the new interface. We've also added some presets for some of the animation to be able to speed up that animation process for you. And if you don't have the tool or feature that you need, well, just write your own. FormZ 7 does have FormZ scripting, so you can go in and customize any of the existing tools or functionality that FormZ offers. It's just a quick way to take the existing functionality that's already in the program and just use it in a unique, customized way using the FormZ scripting. And this concludes the Discover FormZ 7 Part 2 video.